nice introduction. Thank you all for joining this session. I know you probably had very exciting Saturday night quarantine plans, but you changed them to join this lecture. I just want to confirm that everybody can hear me and that everybody can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Um, so, Dr. Pereira said that I work with Tabula Rasa Healthcare, and it's a medication risk management company. So our main goal is, precision medicine, and I get to combine my PhD degree with my pharmacy degree in like a perfect blend. So I'm very happy to be here. It's great to be back at BCP also in some capacity. And what I hope to do today is give you an introduction to this field called pharmacogenomics. It's a relatively new field. So in science, 10 years old is still relatively new. So it's a new field. And it's difficult to touch upon all the aspects in a short time. So there's some extra reading material that I've sent over to Dr. Pereira in an email, so she can maybe put it in the chat or send it to you all on email later. Um, Now, since it's a budding field, there's a lot of potential for research, development, as well as commercialization, both in India and abroad. So what I hope to do with this lecture is to give you sort of a primer on what pharmacogenomics is. And then if you're more interested, we can talk about, having more lectures or something like that. Now, since we are a small group here, I would like this to be a little bit informal and as interactive as possible. So if you have questions in the middle of the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I can see the chat here, or you can, unmute yourself and pipe up. Also remember that if I ask a question and you're nodding yes or no, I can't see your cameras, so I would prefer it if you put it in the chat. So this slide is just to say that my disclosure is that I'm an employee and shareholder of TRHC, and that TRHC had no role in the development of any material in this presentation. So if you don't like the presentation, you have to blame me, not TRHC. So before we start, let's just see what's the difference and if there is a difference between genetics and pharmacogenomics or pharmacogenetics. So pharmacogenomics and genetics is kind of used interchangeably. And though there's some slight differences between the two terms, we are going to stick to pharmacogenomics in this presentation. So I recently took the 23andMe ancestry test, which is a genetic test. This told me that I'm 100% South Indian subgroup, which was not a surprise at all. But this is the one thing that genetics can tell you, among many others. Genetics can tell you about your ancestry. It can tell you the probability of what skin color you have, what eye color you have, what hair color you have. It can tell you about disease risk. It can tell you about whether you have an increased or decreased risk of diabetes, of certain types of cancer. It can also tell you stuff like whether or not you have wet or dry earwax. So it can get pretty intimate, the ancestry composition. So how is this similar or different than pharmacogenomics? As you guys might have guessed, the word pharm in it gives it's somewhat related to drugs, right? That's exactly what it is. Pharmacogenomics is a part of genetics, which is involved in how drugs are acting in your body or how your body is responding to drugs. So it's a very important part of precision medicine. And it can affect whether a patient responds to drugs or they don't respond to drugs, or whether they have adverse events and sometimes even fatal consequences. So it's a very important part of precision medicine, though it's not the only part. It is, like I said, it is gaining momentum in today's scientific world. So with that, this is a quick outline, and this is how the presentation is going to be structured. So first, we'll go over some basic concepts that you probably learned in maybe 12th standard biology or like the first few years of BPharm. So we'll just brush up on those. Then we'll get into the nitty-gritties of pharmacogenomics in medical practice. We'll do a few exercises of if we get a certain genetic test result, what do we do with this patient? So in this particular section, I'd love it if you guys would speak up in the chat or unmute yourselves. And then we'll talk about some limitations and resources because, you know, Ramban nahi hota, koi bhi, it's not like pharmacogenomics is going to solve all the problems in pharmacy. So we'll talk about some pharmacogenomics. And then we'll talk about what y'all can do as pharmacists in this field. So forgive me if I switch to Hindi from time to time because, you know, I'm talking to an Indian audience. So, but I try not to do that a lot. Okay, so let's start with the most basic concept, okay? What is a gene? A gene encodes information. Now, this information is in the form of DNA. It is read by your mRNA and it's translated to a protein. And proteins basically make everything in your body work, right? So to understand whatever we're going to be talking about in this lecture, first we have to define what an allele is. Now you have to pay attention here because first of all, we're going to be using it throughout the presentation. And second, I'm going to be talking about Hrithik Roshan. So you have to pay attention. So we're talking about Hrithik and Suzanne here. Suzanne has brown eyes. Okay, so we are going to consider that she has a brown, which is BB genotype, and she got one brown gene allele from each of her parents. We're going to assume the same for Hrithik Roshan. He has hazel green eyes, according to Wikipedia, and I couldn't find the exact shade of his eyes on PowerPoint, forgive me, but this is the closest that I could get. So we're going to consider that his genotype is GG. So when they had their first son, Ridan got one allele from each parent. He got B and he got G. Now, when we're talking about a single allele, both of these are coding for eye color. So they want to tell your body that this is how your eye color should be. So they're the same gene, but they're variants of the same gene. So these are called alleles. So when you're talking about a single gene, you're referring to an allele. But in an embryo, these two alleles come together in the final chromosome, you know. So when you're talking about both, it's called BG and it's called a diplotype. So this is going to become important. And in a diplotype, there's one pair of gene from your mom and one pair of gene from your dad. Now, what I've written here, BG, is a genotype. But when Ridan was born and he had brown eyes, the brown eyes is called a phenotype. So a genotype is what you can see in your genes. A phenotype is what you can see physically. So this can, for example, your genes tell you that you have a certain risk of diabetes. But your phenotype would be whether or not you have diabetes actually in reality, right? So that's the difference. I've given an example here about the HbA1 gene, and this is tested for both parents before they both members of the couple before they decide to become parents to see if the child will have a risk of thalassemia or not. So a diplotype is always more important than an allele. So now that we've talked about variants or mutations, let's see how these actually come about. What actually happens to get your genes mutated? So let's get back into the basics. You know that genes are made up of DNA. DNA is made up of 4 base pairs. I'm sure all of you are aware of them. It's A, G, C, and T. Sometimes T is substituted for U. So DNA is basically long codes and sequences of these 4 nucleotides or base pairs. So when the mRNA is trying to translate this gene into a protein, it reads 3 nucleotides at a time. And this code of 3 nucleotides codes for an amino acid. Generally, reading a gene starts from a start codon. For example, ATG codes for methionine. So that's a start codon. And it ends with, like, it tells the mRNA ki bas abhi yahi ruk ja. So the stop codon is generally TAG. TAG generally doesn't code for any amino acid. So that's where the mRNA knows that it has to stop making the gene. So some of the very common mutations that are found in humans are SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. So this means that one single nucleotide in the whole sequence is changed. So it can change from, like the example here, it can change from CAT to CCT. And sometimes this causes a total change in what amino acid it codes for, histidine to proline. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes UUU is changed to UUC, and both of them code for phenylalanine. So there's not going to be any difference in the final protein. But sometimes it can change the protein function. It can increase or decrease it. As you can see here, sometimes if your AAG gets mutated to TAG, it tells the mRNA to just stop making the protein at like a middle point. So instead of your 500 amino acid protein, maybe you'll just get a 250 amino acid protein, and that's called a truncated protein. Truncated proteins, not necessarily that they don't have activity, but it's possible that that activity is altered. And sometimes there are other like more significant mutations, like insertions, like a whole section or one nucleotide or a section of nucleotides will be inserted into the sequence or deleted or duplicated. Sometimes the reading frame of the mRNA is completely shifted so that some completely different protein is made or no protein is made at all. Now you can imagine that we have every human has around 20 to 25,000 genes in their body. So how many base pairs is that? And plus there's a bunch of non-coding region, which also affects a lot of how proteins are made, because there's promoter regions and there's repressor regions and all of that. So can you imagine how many mutations must exist in a human genome? I can't. So even the scientists couldn't. So they are like, okay, we have to wrap our heads around this in some way. So they came up with two ideas. The first was that we'll concentrate on genes that are affecting disease state, right? So we don't care about eye color, hair color, and all of that. We'll concentrate on genes that are affecting your disease state. This can be direct or indirect. So direct means that it is increasing the risk for Alzheimer's or it's increasing the risk for Parkinson's. Indirect is कि कोई drug दे रहे हैं हम एक particular disease के लिए. So is this drug going to be effective or not? So that is the first thing they decided to look at. And the second thing they decided to do was they decided to give these variants standardized names across all publication platforms, so that when you are talking about a variation and I'm talking about a variation, we are talking about the same thing. So before we actually get into pharmacogenomics in medical practice, I'd like to go over quickly about how this naming system takes place. And I'm going to call it the STAR system because why not? So let's start with the very basic. STAR1 is a wild type or normal allele, which is found in the majority of the population. So they started with STAR1. And this is an allele. Like I said before, we are talking about a single gene, not a pair of genes, right? A single gene is called an allele and STAR1 is normal. Then they started looking at every single protein, and then every SNP they found or every mutation they found, they started giving it extra numbers like STAR2, STAR3, STAR40, STAR50. There's a lot of mutations in some genes, right? Then when you talk about a diplotype, you get like one allele from your dad, one allele from your mom. So it's going to be STAR-X, STAR-Y. So let's look at a few examples. I'm going to take a very common example of CYP450 isoforms. Dr. Pereira told me that most of you are MPharm and PhD students, so I don't have to tell you how important the CYP450 system is in the liver, is the star of the show when metabolism is concerned. And there are a lot of isoforms of CYP2C, CYP450, and some of them are listed here. And these are involved in metabolism of particular drugs. So we are going to take the example of CYP2C19. So what are the variant alleles? Like I've said before, the normal function allele is STAR1. Does this mean that everything apart from STAR1 is a non-functioning allele? Not necessarily. For example, if you see CYP2D6, STAR10 is also normal function allele, but STAR4 and 5 are poor function alleles. So it's kind of random. And don't worry about it, you don't have to remember all of this. There are free online resources available which kind of have all of this information. So you don't have to remember any of it. But just as an example, STAR2 and STAR3 are poor function alleles for CYP2C19. Does it mean that STAR2 is poor function for CYP2C19 and that means STAR2 is poor function for CYP2D6 also? No. This STAR2, STAR3 is very particular for a particular protein. So now STAR2 and STAR3 are poor function alleles. This means that the enzyme is either going to have very low activity or it's going to have no activity at all. On the other side of the spectrum, you have STAR17, which is an ultra rapid function. So the function of your enzyme is going to be increased a lot. So let's look at some patient examples, right? So say patient 1 comes to you with a STAR1, STAR1 phenotype, which is he got STAR1, which is a wild type allele from his mom and his dad. So he's a normal metabolizer, like I have said 10 times until now. Patient 2 comes with you with a STAR1, STAR2 diplotype. This means that he has one normal function allele and one poor function allele. So this means he's somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. He doesn't have completely normal function, doesn't have completely low function. So we call them intermediate metabolizers. It's somewhere between normal and poor. Third patient has unfortunately gotten both poor function alleles from both their parents. This means that they're poor metabolizers. What does this mean? If you're giving them a drug, like for example, let's say antipsychotics like citalopram or clozapine, these are metabolized by CYP2C19. If you give this patient a normal dose, and it's a long-term dose, the drug is not going to get metabolized. It's going to get built up in your plasma. So first, they might have efficacy to some extent, but they're going to have a lot of adverse drug reactions. So you might have to reduce the dose. So this is how it works a little bit. Now let's move to the other side of the spectrum. This patient has star 1 and star 17, which means he's neither a complete normal metabolizer, neither is he completely ultra rapid. He's somewhere in the middle, and that's called rapid metabolizer or RM. And our patient 5 got both star 17 alleles. And this means he's an ultra rapid metabolizer. This means जैसे ही drug पहुंचता liver में, it gets completely metabolized. And this means that at a normal dose, all of the citalopram or clozapine is getting immediately metabolized and there's not going to be any efficacy. You see this a lot actually in medical practice, especially for antidepressants and antipsychotics. The responder rate is very low. And pharmacogenomics might be one way to explain this variability. So armed with all this information and we've brushed up on our basic concepts, let's take a look at why do we care? Okay, so we have a bunch of medicines in the market. They seem to be working okay for now. And we have randomized clinical trials to make sure that statistically and clinically they have significance. So what's the problem? Why do we need to complicate things with all these variants and star system and all and have pharmacogenomics in medical practice? You'd be surprised to know that a statistic said that 50% of the medications on the market do not achieve the desired response in patients. 50% is a large number of medications. And though pharmacogenomics is not going to explain all of it, it can explain a lot of it. So the main aim of pharmacogenomics is to get the right medication at the right dose to the right population, which is kind of the aim of precision medicine, right? So right now what we're doing is in randomized control trials, we are recruiting a group of patients and it's supposed to be random, right? Of course, you have inclusion and exclusion criteria, but apart from that, we assume that this is a representation of the population as a whole. And once the drug gets approved, there's a standard dose. There's some sort of flexibility in the standard dose, but generally it's like same diagnosis, same prescription. But in one group of patients, this drug is toxic but beneficial. For example, chemotherapy drugs. We know that they're toxic, but they're also beneficial. So here we have to kind of weigh the pros and cons and we can still give the drug to the patient. There's one group of drugs where the drug is not toxic, but it's not beneficial also. So क्यों देना है फिर? There's no point in giving this drug to the patients. There's another group which is the most dangerous. The drug is toxic but not beneficial at all. So we definitely want to avoid giving the drug or like altering the dose in this patient population. And the fourth is where the drug is not toxic but beneficial. This is ideal, right? So we want to get all these other three groups into this gray group over here. So what has been done in pharmacogenomics up until now? More than 200 US FDA labels have some sort of pharmacogenomics information in their label. So what kind of information does the label have? It's very inconsistent. So for some drugs, the FDA will tell you, hey, before you give this drug, you need to do a pharmacogenomic test for XYZ gene and then only give the drug. But then once you get the genetic result, what to do with that genetic result? That they've not said in the FDA label. Some other FDA labels are very extensive. They're like, okay, do a genetic test. If you find this genotype, alter the dose. If you find this genotype, don't change the dose. If you find this genotype, don't give this drug at all. So some of them have like more extensive information, some of them don't. The final aim of pharmacogenomics would be to have extensive pharmacogenomic information in all the drug labels. So for now, I think oncology has a lot of pharmacogenomic information because targeted medicine is more common in oncology than other medication streams. There's a lot of pharmacogenomic information for analgesic opioids like codeine, tramadol, hydrocodone, etc. And there is also important PGX information in antiplatelet drugs like warfarin and clopidogrel. So the main question is, how do these genes affect the commonly used drugs? Like, so it can either affect the pharmacokinetics of the drug or it can affect the pharmacodynamics. Now, y'all are all MPharm and PhD students, so I don't need to explain to you the difference between pharmacokinetic implications and pharmacodynamic implications.
Dr. Malvika,
Yeah.
if I can interrupt. Yeah, most of the students joined are UG. I just see few PG. So out of 23, I mean,
Okay.
like 15 are UG.
Oh, okay. So then
Yeah.
I'll explain the difference between PK and PG.
A little bit basics, if you can just.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. That's a good point. Okay, so since all of you are undergrads, there are pharmacokinetic implications and pharmacodynamic implications. So I think the 4 basic processes of pharmacokinetics, I think everybody learned in first year of pharmacology. And can anybody put in the chat box what the main 4 processes of PK are? Yes, Ankit, good job. It's ADME. So that's absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, right? So the main kind of genetic implications in yes, good job, Mansi and Dilip Kumar. So where genetics comes in PK is mainly in metabolism. Like I talked about the CYP450 system in your liver is the star of the show here. It metabolizes 75 to 90% of prescribed medication. So there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong over here, right? So a lot of these genetic variants are in your CYP450 system. There are some genetic variants in your drug transporters, which are involved in excretion. So there's this transporter called SLCO1B1. उसमें अगर genetic differences रहेंगे तो it will affect simvastatin, which is a statin lipid lowering drug. It will affect pharmacokinetics of that drug. Then the other part that we'll talk about is pharmacodynamic implications. Pharmacodynamics is what your drug does to the body, right? So it's efficacy and its toxicity. So efficacy may say caffeine is binding to adenosine receptors in your brain and keeping you awake. But if there's a mutation in your adenosine receptors, the coffee is not going to work anymore and you want to go to sleep. So this is a pharmacodynamic change in your genes. Another is hypersensitivity reactions. So there are some people who get hypersensitivity reactions, some people who don't. So are genetics involved in that? Maybe, we'll see. So thank you, Shivam. Let me just see what your question is. There are some drugs. So Shivam is asking, there are some drugs whose half-life is genetically dependent. Like some populations can metabolize the drug fast while the others can metabolize it slowly. So is this because of allele recombination or there are other genetic factors governing this? If the TRF is dependent on metabolism, and for example, like I said, if this drug gets metabolized by CYP2C19 and yeah, like slow and fast acetylators, yeah, that is genetically dependent. And if CYP2C19 poor metabolizer hai, so obviously the drug will not get metabolized and your T-half will increase. So yes, it is principally pharmacogenomics, but it could be other factors, like you're taking other drugs which are so pharmacogenetically, so you're a normal metabolizer, but you're taking other drugs that are inhibiting this enzyme. So that can also cause the change in pharmacokinetic parameters. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, in that how you have to look at pharmacogenomics also in a holistic concept. It's not like बस genes तो ये बोल रहा है तो यही करेंगे हम, ऐसे नहीं. We have to kind of look at what other drugs they are taking, what they're eating, how their disease status is, all of that. Okay. So before we move on to actually talking about some patient cases, which I think you all will like, let's see, we'll talk about some resources. Like I said, you don't have to remember all of this because all of this is available online and free. and y'all can just Google like whatever resources I'll have so that you can find them. So the first and gold standard is US FDA labels and tables. These labels have a wealth of information in them, not just pharmacogenomics, but even pharmacology information. And if I would suggest that all of you go look at like you can Google like the name of the drug and US FDA label. And if you're doing some drug in pharmacology and you have it for your exams, I feel like it'll be a good exercise to go and Google this and see what all information the US FDA label has, because it has very, very useful information in it. But like I said before, the US FDA label sometimes will just tell you ki, do this test or not before you give the drug to the patient. But you know, all the doctors are overworked. US may come compared to India, but um,
Dr. Malvika, you're inaudible.
sorry, I think something happened.
Okay. Thank you.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I don't know what happened. I actually can't see any of the chat box or anything, so just give me a minute. Let me fix this. Okay, so for some reason I can't see the chat box. So Dr. Pereira, if you can monitor it and let me know.
No problem. If any questions are there, I'll just raise hand if you can see that, or
to be honest, I can't see anything or I don't know what happened.
okay, and then I'll verbally interrupt it. No problem.
Thank you. Okay, so where did you hear the FDA labels part or no?
Yes, we did.
So the FDA labels, like I said, sometimes just tell you whether or not to order the test, and they don't tell you anything else. So doctors are overworked, as we know, and they don't have time to sit and be like, oh, star 2, star 3 hai, to poor metabolizer. Okay, what do I do with the dose now? They don't have all that time. So there are certain organizations like CPIC, for example, and there are other organizations like the Dutch Pharmacogenetics Working Group, which is DPWG, that have come up with guidelines. These guidelines basically tell you everything that you need to do, right? It'll tell you what variants have what function. So if they're poor function, increased function, normal function, all of that. Then they'll tell you if this is the diplotype, this person is a poor metabolizer. If this is the diplotype, this person is a normal metabolizer. Additionally, they'll tell you what will happen to the drug if you're a poor metabolizer and what is the clinical decision that you need to make. So like I said, you don't have to remember a lot. You just have to know where to look. There's another really good source called PharmGKB. It's called the Pharmacogenetic Knowledge Base. And this has a lot of information in that. It has your normal pharmacokinetic pathways, and it has a lot of pharmacogenomic information, and it has links to all the research papers that talk about the pharmacogenomics information. So it's a very good resource if you all want to check out. I think it's pharmgkb.org. So now let's get into some patient cases. And like I said, I can't see the chat box anymore because some technical problem happened. So if you can unmute yourselves and pipe up if you have the answer, that'll be great. Extra brownie points if you do that. So like I said, pharmacokinetic genes are mainly genes that affect metabolism and transport as long as genetics is concerned. So the first example we want to take is codeine. I think a lot of us know codeine as an antitussive, but I'm going to talk about codeine here as an analgesic opioid. At least here in the US, I don't know about the prescribing practices in India. It is given a lot after dental surgery. So is codeine giving pain control? No. Codeine is a prodrug in this situation. And we all know what prodrugs are. Prodrugs are converted into their active form inside the blood. This is generally done by metabolism. So for example, here codeine is converted into morphine inside your body, and this is principally done by the enzyme CYP2D6. So CYP2D6 converts codeine into morphine, and morphine is the one that gives you pain control, right? So you know this information, and a patient comes to you, and he's a star 1 normal metabolizer. Do you give him the standard dose of codeine or not? Can anybody tell me? It's a 50-50% chance of being right. So, okay, well, I'm going to tell you the answer. Yes, you can give him a normal dose of CYP2D6 because he's a normal metabolizer. He's going to convert the codeine into morphine, and you're going to have pain control. But this second patient comes to you now, and he's a star 4, star 5. And this CPEC guidelines tell you that star 4, star 5 is a poor metabolizer. So basically, the CYP2D6 is not working. So this patient complains that I'm taking all this codeine, but I'm not getting any pain control. So you're like, oh, what to do now? So what do you think would be a good way? Do you still continue codeine or do you not continue codeine? Come on, guys, this is a simple question.
Dr. Malvika, Neha's responded discontinue.
Yes.
So is Shivam.
Okay, good job, Neha and Shivam. So basically, because your CYP2D6 is not working, unless you're giving codeine for antitussive effect, it's not going to be useful. So the pain control is not going to happen. Because it's not going to get converted into morphine in your body. So this is how generally genetic results are interpreted. Now let's talk a little bit about what if your patient 1 is a star 1 normal metabolizer and he's still complaining of pain control. So there are a lot of things, like I said, there's a probability with genes of being a normal metabolizer. There are a lot of other things in the environment that can affect your genes and make them non-functional. So an interesting fact is that hing or asafoetida extract is a CYP2D6 inhibitor. So say that your tooth is aching and somebody read on WhatsApp that hing ka pani is like great for you and will help you heal your gums. And you've drank a bunch of hing ka pani in the morning and then you're taking codeine and you're not getting pain control. So it might be because hing is actually inhibiting your CYP2D6 and it's not getting converted to morphine. So like I said, in genetics, you have to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at the gene. But in general, if you're a normal metabolizer, you're not doing anything crazy, you're going to get pain control. Okay, so now that you know how to interpret these genetic results, we're going to have one more example. And I hope that more of you will answer in the chat box for this one because this is a little easier. Oh, but before I move on, actually, so this is how the CPEC guidelines look. So for example, if you go right here down to the row, it tells you, okay, so you're a poor metabolizer. The implication for this is that morphine is not going to be formed in your body and there's not going to be insufficient pain relief. Then the recommendation is that avoid use of codeine. Avoid use of codeine तो बोला है, पर instead क्या use करें हम? वो भी बताते हैं यहाँ पे. They say that other opioid analgesics like tramadol, hydrocodone, oxycodone, they won't be useful either because they are also metabolized by CYP2D6. So just go for drugs that are not metabolized by CYP2D6, or you can give non-opioid analgesics. Now, one option is that why can't you just give morphine directly, right? Why do you have to even give codeine? So if the patient is in the hospital, yeah, you can put an IV line and you can give morphine, but morphine is not available as an oral dose. So in an outpatient setting, you can't really give morphine. So, okay, moving on to our next case. This is omeprazole, which is a proton pump inhibitor, and it reduces acid in your stomach, to put it simply. Omeprazole is not a prodrug. It has direct action in the body. So it is the actual drug. It is converted by CYP2C19 into inactive metabolites. Basically, it's excreted from the body, right? So the first patient comes to you. He's a star 1 normal metabolizer for CYP2C19. So what you say is that normal metabolizer, give him the normal dose of omeprazole, right? But the second patient comes to you. He's star 2, star 3. So he's a poor metabolizer. So what do you think you should do in this situation? There are 3 options that you have. Keep the same dose, reduce the dose or increase the dose? What do you think, A, B or C? Does anybody have the answer? No? Okay.
Ankit just requested if you can repeat the question.
Okay. So omeprazole is a drug. It's not a prodrug. So omeprazole is going to basically go and act in your body to reduce acid secretion. Using CYP2C19, it gets converted into inactive metabolites. So our patient 2 has presented to us with a poor metabolizer phenotype. This means that the CYP2C19 is not working in this patient. So when you give omeprazole, it's not getting converted into inactive metabolites. So would you keep the same dose, A, for the patient? Would you reduce the dose for the patient? Or would you increase the dose for the patient? Those are the three options.
To this, Neha, Siddhi and Ankit, along with Dilip, Shivam, all have one answer, and that's reduce. Even Shweta.
Very
so 5
good.
reduce.
Okay, so all of you are getting what I'm saying. Good job. So yes, you're right. Because since the CYP2C19 is not working, omeprazole is going to get built up in your body. It's going to get built up in your plasma and it's probably going to have side effects, right? So you want to reduce the dose. Let's go on the other side of the spectrum. Now I'm pretty sure you all can answer very quickly. This patient has a star 17 genotype, which means he's an ultra rapid metabolizer. As soon as omeprazole hits the liver, it's getting converted into inactive metabolites. So in this situation, would you keep the same dose? Would you reduce the dose or would you increase the dose?
So we have 4 answers. Shivam, Neha, Siddhi, Dilip, Mansi, all increase. 5.
Okay, good job. Yes, because otherwise you're not going to have any efficacy at all. So that's why you have to increase the dose. Now you all did a great job, and this is exactly what the CPIC guidelines say. So if it's a CYP2C19 poor metabolizer, initiate a standard daily dose, but for chronic therapy, consider 50% reduction in daily dose and monitor for efficacy, right? Similarly, for an ultra rapid metabolizer, they say that increase the starting daily dose by 100%. So this is just to show you that you need to know how to interpret this, but you don't need to know it for every single thing because all of it is available online in these guidelines. So now that we've kind of covered pharmacokinetic genes, we are going to dive into pharmacodynamic genes. If you remember what I said before, these are genes associated with efficacy or toxicity of the drugs. So first we'll talk about toxicity because that's more exciting, right? Let's talk about this gene called HLA-B. Now this is a notorious gene. It has a lot of SNPs in it and it affects a lot of drugs. So HLA-B is a gene that plays a role in something called the major histocompatibility complex. Now this is a big protein and plays a role in your immune system. What is the main role it plays is that it recognizes when a virus binds to it, it recognizes whether it's self or non-self. So basically, if it's non-self, it's going to trigger an immune response and want to kill the virus, right? But sometimes what happens is at this virus binding site, there are certain drugs. Like I've given here, for example, carbamazepine, that's an anti-seizure drug. Abacavir, that's used for like HIV and stuff, like viral infections. So these drugs can also bind to the same receptor and they trigger an immune response. And it tells the body that, oh, there's a foreign material in the body when there actually is not. And this results in a hypersensitivity reaction, which is called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It mainly manifests as a skin like dermatitis and everything, but it's actually a systemic disease. So it affects all the organs in your body. And if not controlled properly, it can be fatal. So for carbamazepine and abacavir, FDA has this information in their labels that before you start giving this drug, you have to test for these genes. Because if you don't test, and like in the past, like carbamazepine is a very old drug. So in the past, it was just like dekhe dekhte hai, hua kuch hai, to we'll give steroids and control the immune reaction. But that is what we want to move away from in the field of medicine. So now we have to test for this star 1502 variant and the star 5701 variant for these respective drugs. before we even start giving the drug. And the clinical management strategy is that if it is star 1502 positive, you just avoid the drug. Don't give it at all because it can be fatal, like I said. Now, this is about toxicity. The second part is about efficacy. And in efficacy, I'm going to be talking mainly about oncology because, like I said, यहाँ पे targeted treatment बहुत common है. One important thing to know is that in oncology especially, your tumor is going to have a different DNA than your germline DNA, that is you, your body. So when you're doing pharmacogenetic testing to see whether or not a cancer drug will work, you have to test the tumor of the DNA, not the tumor of your germline, which is your body, right? So a lot of these labels for imatinib, trastuzumab, and vemurafenib have all this information in their labels. Test for this particular gene mutation before you give this drug. So only if the BCR-ABL translocation is present will imatinib be useful. Only if the HER2 amplification is present, trastuzumab is really useful in breast cancer. And only if the BRAF V600E mutation is present, vemurafenib will be useful. So I think oncology is like running ahead in the pharmacogenomics field compared to the other drug classes, but other drug classes will also get there eventually. I'm optimistic. So this is a little bit about the pharmacodynamic genes, and up to now, I've been telling you all how great pharmacogenomics is and how useful it can be. And yes, it can be useful, and it's a great field to be in. But we also have to recognize that there are very real limitations to this field, right? The first one, and I find that as a minority ethnic group in a Western country, I find that this is very important, is that a lot of the variant data is collected in Caucasian populations because it is collected from huge projects like the Human Genome Project that has all been conducted in the Western countries. So say star 2 and star 3 are poor metabolizers, but most of the Caucasians are star 2 and star 3. You don't even find star 2 and star 3 in Indian populations. Then what is the use of having that information to us, to an Indian population, right? So that is a major limitation, and it's called frequency of alleles. Is that frequency of alleles depends on your ethnicity. So I think there's some information generally if you read pharmacogenomic studies that are published from the US or other Western countries. They have races, they have like different groups in their bar graphs for races like maybe Black or Latino, Hispanic, and Asians are grouped as one race. As you all know, Asians are like a huge major chunk of the world population, right? There's Chinese, South Korean, Vietnamese, Indian, Pakistani, everything. And then you can't really group them as one because there's so much genetic variation in these groups. So I was talking to a professor from University of Philadelphia, and he said that he basically said that countries like China and South Korea are investing huge amounts of money in creating local population biobanks, which means that they can have genetic data of their own population. And there are a lot of people who are using like machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence to deal with this huge amount of data to find out कि यार हमारे population में क्या variants है, so that we can actually target these drugs to our population. So I think India is a little bit behind in that and we need to catch up. But this is one way. The other thing I can think of is the cultural aspect of it. Like I said before, hing is a CYP2D6 inhibitor. It's not really used at all in like a lot of other cuisines compared to Indian cuisine, right? These people talk a lot about grapefruit juice being a CYP450 inhibitor. But India mein kaun peeta hai grapefruit juice? Hardly anybody. So we need a more culturally local context to pharmacogenomics. We need to see whatever ingredients we use in India, how useful they are. So a lot of research needs to be conducted locally on pharmacogenomics. The second major limitation is that randomized control trials are sometimes unfeasible. Now, RCTs are the gold standard. If you want to get a drug approved by the FDA, you have to do a randomized control trial. Say you recruit 100 patients. 99 of them are normal metabolizers. एक कोई तो है poor metabolizer. You are never going to get enough power in your study to actually make a statistical comparison. So for fields like pharmacogenomics, which is not affecting a wide variety of population, but it is affecting some people in a major and severe way, we have to convince the regulatory authorities that there are other study designs that might be more useful than randomized controlled trials. So this is an ongoing effort, and the US FDA does agree to some extent, but we still need to convince them a little bit more. Then the third is that patient and provider education is lacking. The one obvious reason for that is that this is a very new field and it takes time for people to adopt it. So there's a lack of education in this field. Another is that providers, for example, doctors or pharmacists who are older, and they didn't learn about pharmacogenomics at all in medical school. And they'll be like, "Arey, humko kya sikhate ho?" Like we've seen a lot of patients, we know how to tailor dose and all. Don't tell us about this all complicated things. So they're very resistant to using this. So you have to kind of convince them using, real world data. You have to conduct studies. You have to convince them that this is going to be useful in their patients. And the patient education is difficult because, as you can see, y'all are all pharmacy students, so you can maybe understand this to some extent, but putting this in lay language, especially local languages, is going to be very difficult. So patient education is a severe hurdle in pharmacogenomics. Now, this reimbursement from health insurance companies is not as big a deal in India as it is in Western countries because not a lot of people depend on health insurance. We generally pay out of pocket for everything. And that's why we have a cap on drug prices and test prices and everything. But for people who do use health insurance, this is going to be a major hurdle. If a health insurance company says that I'm not going to reimburse this because I don't believe in it, and then it costs like $4,000 to get a pharmacogenetic test, then you're going to be like, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'd rather try 5 different drugs before one works for me. So we have to convince health insurance companies that this is a very important thing to test for, and it's going to save you money eventually because the patient is going to get it right at the first or second drug. So these are in general limitations. Now I'm going to focus a little bit on local, which is like Indian limitations. Before I get into that, sorry, phenoconversion. I think I talked about this a little bit before, in that there are a lot of other factors except genetics that can influence how your enzymes work, right? One of them is, what are you eating? What concomitant drugs are you taking? If patients are taking 5 drugs at a time, there's going to be some drug-drug interactions that's going to change your phenotype. Then there's disease states. Sometimes diabetes can change the function of your enzymes. And they're finding more and more that there are certain chronic diseases, especially inflammatory diseases, that can change the function of your enzymes. So phenoconversion is the difference. Like genotype एक चीज बता रही है, but phenotype तुमको और कुछ दिख रहा है. So it's the conversion of phenotype that is called phenoconversion. So this is also it's not really a limitation. It tells you that pharmacogenomics has to be looked at in a holistic way. You can't just look at genes and get done with it. So these are a few specific limitations that are found for oncology studies in India. I found this information from this paper that I've cited in the bottom, and I've sent the PDF to Dr. Pereira, so she can send it to you guys if you want to read more details. But one of the main limitations they say is the studies that are conducted for pharmacogenomics in India are mainly government funded. And we all know, like in India, healthcare budget or research budget is pretty low for the government. So basically, there's a lack of funding for studies. There's a lack of cheap lab tests available with reasonable turnaround times. So if the lab test is, even if it's cheap, you have to get the lab results back within, say, maximum a week, right? You can't wait for months and months to get the lab result back because you have to treat the patient. Then there's a lack of skilled personnel, and that might lead to the fourth point, which is a lack of education. Because not a lot of PGX studies are being conducted, people don't know how to design these studies. I'll get into how y'all can actually, as pharmacists, as future pharmacists, I want to get you excited about the field of pharmacogenomics and what all you can do in this field. So that's going to be my last slide. Where do you come in? So all of these 5 are kind of interlinked, and I'm pretty sure there are more. I could only think of these 5 when I was making this presentation. But first and foremost is education. So institutions, like premier institutions like BCP, who are kind of leading the world of pharmacy, they can have certificate courses or electives which get everybody familiarized with pharmacogenomics. And Dr. Pereira and I were talking about it. So if y'all are interested in this field and you would like to know more, you can talk to her, or you can get in touch with me, and we can arrange more lectures which will go more in depth, because I was just touching upon some topics today. If you get into research, if you're B.Pharm students, you plan to go to M.Pharm, or if you're M.Pharm students planning to go to PhD, you can actually conduct this research, which is lacking in India. You can conduct research on what are the variants that are found in an Indian population, so that we can see what drug effects are there in those variants and help our local population. If you get into the industry after your degree, you can, and if you get into clinical research, then you can promote the endpoint. You can put pharmacogenomics as one of the endpoints in your clinical research groups. If you get into pharmacovigilance, this can also be done, kind of post-marketing. Also, you can seek a genetic result, mil raha hai to how the ADRs are affected or side effects are affected. Other than that, you can go into development of low-cost PGX testing. So you can develop new assays that you can test for cheaper than found in Western countries. So ISRO sent a rocket to Mars at lower than the interstellar budget. So, India has potential. So we can develop something low cost for pharmacogenetics. The other two that I'm talking about, advocacy and pharmacist, is more long term, because I believe that there can be a greater role of a pharmacist in the healthcare team. We learn a lot of pharmacology, even more than what they teach in medical school in India, to be honest, in their curriculum. We have more of a grip on how to adjust dose, what are the side effects, and all of that. I think we need to advocate as pharmacists for a greater role in that. We are not just there to sit behind the counter and dispense drugs. Right? We have so much more information, and we can be so much more useful than that. We can go on rounds with doctors and we can help them tailor dosage. And this is being done in Western countries. It's not unheard of. I think there are some PharmD courses also in India which are training pharmacists for this, but it's not really, trickling down into the actual hospital. So I think we need to advocate for a greater role of pharmacists in the healthcare team. This can be only done by advocacy groups, and then you have to change the regulation and you change the law. It's a long process. But once that happens, the pharmacist can provide interpretive services. This is what a pharmacist, a pharmacogenomic pharmacist in the US does. They have PGX clinics. So when the patient gets the pharmacogenetic results, the pharmacist actually interprets it and tells the physician, okay, XYZ is what you need to do. This not only saves time for the physician, it also kind of takes some of the stress off of them, that I don't have to learn a whole different subject, So they provide interpretation services, and I'm hoping and I'm positive that pharmacists in India can in the future do this, because I gave you 2-3 patient examples and you all were great at interpreting the results right now also. So have some confidence. And the second thing, and very important thing, is patient education. I know that in India, a lot of patients will come to the pharmacist and say, ki pet dukh raha hai, kya loon? So patients are already trusting pharmacists to have information about drugs. So the trust is there. So we can leverage this trust and educate the patients. I say, like while talking in conversation, you can be like, do you know how genes can affect your body, So you can play a role in patient education, like translating it to local languages and all of that. So with that, I would like to end this presentation and thank you all for listening to me. I hope you learned something new today, and I've gotten you a little bit excited about pharmacogenomics as much as I am at TRHC. And now I will take questions, if you have any.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Malvika. That was a great insight.
Thank you.
We have with us on session a very interesting faculty, you'd remember, Krishna Iyer, sir.
Oh, hello, sir.
He's put a question that he'd like to raise. So if you can unmute and raise it to Dr. Malvika. Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, you can read it from the chat box.
Okay,
Yes.
I've stopped sharing the slides. So can you hear me?
I'll read it for you, Malvika.
Okay.
So the question is, to what extent do we teach this at undergraduate level? We do phenotyping studies at Bombay College of Pharmacy for SIP and non-SIP.
Oh, that's so exciting. That's awesome. I knew BCP is like ahead of the curve. But I think
Malvika, we
yeah.
have been doing this for several years, even when you were a student here.
Oh really? That's awesome.
So came up to
Yeah.
ask. That's all.
I guess I was not well informed. That's my bad.
So,
But I
think-
think we can definitely teach the basics at the undergraduate level, and especially if we want the pharmacists to actually, have more of a role in this. I think B.Pharm students are very well equipped to understand and learn all of this. So
yeah, we have done phenotyping of N-acetyl transferase, CYP2D6, CYP2A6, CYP2E1, AO, aldehyde oxidase, xanthine oxidase. Many of these we have done.
that's awesome. So do
Uh,
you find a difference in frequency of alleles between like a Caucasian versus an Indian population?
our limited studies seem to indicate that much of the trends we see in an Indian population are mirroring what we see in a Caucasian population.
Oh,
So in
that's interesting.
lucky that some of the dosing schedules which are developed in the Caucasian population seem to also work in the Indian population for this reason. Okay, but this also you have to be very careful. Even when we do a study in an Indian population, we are not quite sure what we are doing because mix in an Indian population is also a, what you call as sub ethnicity. For example,
Yeah.
if I get 200 volunteers, it's not that all are Maharashtrians, that all are Gujaratis. So
Right.
if I see them between in the 200, no, I find different trends. For example, we do find that Sindhis, Gujaratis behave slightly differently than Maharashtrians and South Indians. So, but that is really hard. So the problem is in Mumbai when you pick a population, it's very hard to get only Maharashtrians and only you know. See, when I say Maharashtrian, the definition of Maharashtrian is very odd, right?
Yeah,
Somebody who has studied for many years is a Maharashtrian.
I
But
know.
if you think of it carefully, we are actually talking people who have originally been from here and
Yeah,
not people who have come and settled in Maharashtra over the last 2 generations. So we
that's right.
find difficulty in delineating within the study we do as to what is happening in a micro environment. So in that regard, we have to again relook at some of the data that we have because we do have differences within the population when we start picking at whether they are originally Sindhis or Gujaratis or Tamilians or stuff like that. So
Right. I can imagine like when I put in the first slide my ancestry result, so 23andMe right now has only 5 Indian subgroups. It has, I think, a Northeastern and Bengali. It has a Patidar Gujarati, Pakistani and North Indian, South Indian, and South Indian and Sri Lankan. So it has only 5 subgroups. So I think just collecting like more and more data and family history, like where are your grandparents from? Do you know if their parents are from somewhere else? I think the only way to do that is collect a large population database.
yeah, so it does get tricky a little bit, but
Definitely.
what we are doing is at least get a feel for the phenotype data so that we know in general how our population is. But luckily, we have been co-segregating with Caucasians in most cases.
That's great. That's great if that's the case. That's awesome. So, does anybody else have any questions?
Hello, ma'am.
Hi, Siddhi.
Ma'am, I had a question. Actually, I'm an undergrad student of third year B.Pharm and does not know much about pharmacogenomics. We have recently started studying DNA and RNA in depth, but as we see diabetes as a genetic disorder, uh, and it is hereditary. I mean, in some generations or in some people, it is hereditary. So, is there is R&D going on in how to look at the uh, challenges of increasing diabetes population in India?
Um, that's a great question. And yes, in diabetes, a portion of it you can explain using like hereditary diabetes. And that's where pharmacogenomics kind of comes in, because like I said, genes don't decide everything. So if you have an increased risk of diabetes, doesn't mean you're 100% going to get it. So there's a lot of things you can do. You can improve your diet, you can work out more, and you can work towards limiting how much your genes affect you. So this is where pharmacogenomics comes in. If you test this patient and at 20 or 25 years old, you tell them that, okay, you have an increased risk of diabetes in your genes, so be careful. Armed with this information, this patient can take steps even before diabetes sets in, and they can like eat healthier, exercise more, have less sugar, and maybe even prevent development of the disease or keep it in control using drugs. So you can't you can't get rid of everything, but I think you can limit how much it affects you eventually.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're welcome. Well, if anybody else has questions, I want to send my LinkedIn account to Dr. Pereira so that you all can connect. You can ask me questions if you want. And she also said that some of you all might have questions about like higher education and all of that. So if you have very specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And thank you all for being here today. I really enjoyed this lecture, and I hope we can do more like these in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malvika. Thank you, KI sir. And thank you everyone for sparing your time. They just finished with the exams and they are all there for this interesting session on pharmacogenomics.
Oh
So
my
on
God, I'm
behalf
so sorry, you guys. I didn't know you you just had your exams, or I would have picked another date.
So thank you very much, Dr. Malvika, for dedicating your time for your alma mater. We are indeed privileged to have you, and definitely we look out to more sessions from your end. So with this, we end with today's session. Does anybody have a question or anything to say? I think no, it's not there in the chat box. So with this, I'll just hang up on today's session. Thank you, everyone.